All right. Well, today we are in the second part of the series. It's all the things you don't have to do for God to be good with you, part 2. Like Dr. Seuss. Thank you. So in case this is your first week joining us, we put our messages in a series under a common theme. And this week, we're in the second part of one of those series. Now, to bring you up to speed, I can't go into everything that we talked about last week, but to kind of set the stage, what we're talking about is all the things, all the things. Now, when I say all the things, I mean all the rules and regulations that people associate, that you probably associate with religion, with God, with Jesus. Whenever you hear someone say, well, God wants you to do this, or Jesus said this, or the Bible says this somewhere, all the to-dos and the to-don'ts, the shoulds and the shouldn'ts, and the thou shalt nots. We're looking at all those things. And really the goal of this series is to kind of put them in their place, like to understand them in context. A lot of us were introduced to God at about the same time we were introduced to all these to-dos and to-don'ts. And so God becomes this power-hungry, rule-giving dictator who just wants to make sure you don't color outside the lines. But really, there's so much more to this than that. And so we're trying to kind of rebuild. And where we were last week, what we said is when someone tells you to do something, typically there's a question that goes with that, right? I mean, if you're like me, someone tells you to do something and it's like, why? What's the motive? What's the end? Who says? And what's the goal? And when a lot of us think about all the things, all the religion to-dos, there's no why. They're arbitrary. They're old-fashioned, and it's like, well, there's some people believe there's a God, and he wants us to do things this way because that's what he said. And so all the things become all the things you have to do for God to be good with you. It's like the default setting. We're like, okay, we want, if there's someone up there, and we want to be happy with us, we got to do this stuff. And so what this ends up feeling like is like, well, the right thing to do. You should do the right thing. And maybe then you heard the story about Jesus dying for people who don't deserve it and how you should respond with gratitude. We went there a little bit and we said, okay, well, maybe from there we get to all the things you're willing to do because God has been good to you. And so you live not from a place of guilt, but from a place of gratitude, which is a good thing. It's a step in the right direction. It's definitely better than just doing something so that maybe God will be happy with you. But really, we took this even a step further and explained how when Jesus talked about things his followers should do, it was with their best in mind. In other words, they're not just arbitrary to-dos, rules and regulations. Ideally, the place we want to get to is that these become all the things, maybe even all the things you want to do because God wants good for you. And so they're not the right thing to do. It's not even just the nice thing to do, but what if all these things, what if they really are the best thing for you? And so what we were doing, maybe you should go back and listen to last week if you weren't here. It's available online, but really the idea is the motive behind all of this. What if, even if you don't believe it, even if you're not totally sure, what if you understand the motive behind all of this to be for your good? What if that's the why? So today, this week, what we're doing is kind of hitting this from a different angle, right? Looking at a different part. Last week was the why. Last week was the motive behind all the things. Today, we're looking at a different side. But to start with, I'll tell you a little story. Surprise. So on Monday, I went to New Hampshire, and I went skiing. And that's not something you're going to hear me say very often. It was my friend's birthday. We were celebrating, and I was his present. So his wife sent us both skiing. Now, he likes to ski. I'm not a skier. I don't have any real experience skiing. I went skiing once when I was very young, took like one lesson, and then I went skiing for about an hour on some fake snow in Virginia about 6 years ago. Other than that, I've got no experience skiing. So I don't know skiing. I don't know the terms. I don't know etiquette. I don't know technique. I don't really get skiing. So we show up, and I've just purchased all this stuff to keep me warm, but I still had to rent all the skiing equipment. So I go to the rental place, and I get to the counter, and the guy behind the counter, one of the first thing he asked me, he goes, so are you a level 1, a level 2, or a level 3 skier? I'm like thinking, what's the criteria for this rating system here, And so I don't ski. So naturally I said level 2. And I mean, how am I supposed to know what level I am? I don't ski. So I said level 2. And I think I gave myself away a little bit when I needed him to help me put on the boots because I didn't know how all the straps work. But anyway, we get up there, and I'm just, for a little bit, I'm lost. You have these kids. Now, these skiing people, they really ski. Maybe you're a skiing person, and you really ski. They bring their kids. They're this big, They're this big. And these kids are just going down the mountain. And I'm trying to figure out how to get to the lift, and I'm just totally out of place. I don't know the terms. I got no technique. It's so much. But finally, I got to a point where I was like, let me just look at some people who know what they're doing and maybe try to do what they're doing, right? Like, give me a picture of what it looks like to be good at this. And I can confidently tell you I didn't really ever arrive at good at this, but by the end of the day, I was kind of making it because I had a picture, all right, that person, they're going side to side. I asked my friend, he gave me some pointers, but I needed a visual of what it looked like because it was so much, right? So maybe you were here last week and maybe you were listening and it was like all the things, wow, all these things really, they're motivated by God wanting good for us, all this stuff. But maybe you went home and it was like, okay, so here, do it. And it's just this feeling like, what? Where do I start? Are you a level 1, 2? It can be overwhelming because there's so much. And so maybe if you're like me, it's helpful to have a picture. Now, Jesus, being the smart guy that he was, knew we would need some kind of picture. And so he actually gave his followers, right before he died, he gave them a very clear picture. You go this way and you'll get all the things, all of it. You point in this direction and you'll be on the right track. And if you are totally new to Christianity, or maybe you left for a long time, or maybe you're trying to figure it out, or maybe you don't even want to be here, you can't wait till this is over, but you just aren't totally sure, my hope for you is that this will give you some clarity behind the things that Jesus actually spoke. It doesn't necessarily make things easy, but it does make them clear. And if you are someone who's been in the church for a long time, maybe you've been around for decades and you've been in church every Sunday forever, what we're looking at today is an essential recalibration. He's giving a picture. This is what it looks like to get all the things, all the things. And so he's sitting down at a meal. It's one of the most famous meals ever in the history of the human race. It's called the Last Supper. There's a lot of pretty epic things that happened at this meal. He said some pretty crazy things. The emotions were up and down. They were happy, they were sad, they were confused. But at one point, he makes it very clear. And he gives them his final instructions. And he says this. He says to his followers, the people he called disciples, these guys who were trying to live his way. He says, a new command I give you, a new one. We've been together for 3 years. You've heard me say a lot, but I've got a new one for you. This is the one, a command. Not 10 commandments, not 613 laws, one. You get this right, and you've got it all right. He says, love one another. Period. This is the thing. The one thing. Love one another. Now for us, like love, a lot of things maybe come to mind because we use that word love for a lot of different things. We apply it in a lot of different areas of life. But in the ancient language, there were several different words for love, and the word that is used here, Jesus uses the word agape, which is love that a guy named C.S. Lewis describes as gift love. It is love that is given completely independent of the recipient and anything they've done. It's totally selfless, completely. It is, ready, and maybe this will make it more tangible for you, it is seeking the good of the other for the sake of the other. It is completely consumed with their well-being. And he's like, this is the thing. You get this, and you've got it all right. In fact, Jesus has hinted at this leading up to this moment. Early on, he explained how so much of what they called the law and the prophets, the Old Testament, he's like, it's summed up in this one thing, this idea of love. Paul, who came afterwards, reiterated this over and over again. He said it in a letter to a church in a city called Galatia. He says this, same thing. He says, for the entire law, the entire ancient Jewish Old Testament, 613 ancient laws, not 10, 613. It is fulfilled in keeping this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. In his letter to the church in Rome, which we looked at last week, Paul said this. He said, for whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. He said in another place, the only thing that matters is faith expressing itself through love. This is what it all comes back to. In fact, some scholars, like these really smart people that study this stuff, would say the entire New Testament, all the writings written by followers of Jesus after Jesus, they are just articulations of this idea of love. Here's what love looks like in this situation, in that situation, and in this situation. It all comes back to this, seeking the good of the other for the sake of the other, which is just not easy, but clear. Now, if you've been in church for a while, you know there's a lot of like church things that happen in church, right? There are a lot of extras that come with being in church. And the Apostle Paul, who was a follower of Jesus that came after Jesus and wrote letters to other followers of Jesus, he knew this was gonna happen. And so he even clarified like, okay, you might be into the church things, and that's fine if you're into the church things. But he says, if I speak in the tongues, that means languages, of men or of angels, like miraculous languages, but do not have love, he says, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. I'm making noise for the sake of noise, if it's not seeking the good of the other for the sake of the other. He gives another example. He says, if I have the gift of prophecy, like speaking on behalf of God, like that's pretty spiritual, right? But he says, and if I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, if I am like the source of all divine information, and even if I have faith, that's a big one. He says, if I have faith, and then he quotes Jesus, that can move mountains, but do not have love, he says, I am nothing. I've missed the whole thing. It all comes back to this. This is it. If you're pointed in that direction, you're on track. But if you miss it, it doesn't matter what else comes with it. Seeking the good of the other for the sake of the other. And so the question is, what does it look like? If you're wondering, like, oh, wow, there's all these things, all these things we got to do. What does it look like to do all the things? The question is, what does love look like here? In any and every situation, you're curious, what God, if there's a God and he wants me to do something right now, what does he want me to do? What does it look like to get it right? The question is, what does love look like? What does it look like to seek the good of the other person involved in this situation or the other group of people involved? Totally independent of how it affects me. That's not easy, but it's crystal clear. If we miss this, then we miss the whole entire thing. For me, like a helpful thing to do as a dad is to think, if this person on the other side of me were my son, what would I want for him? How would I want me to respond? If it were my daughter, how would I want to respond? If it were someone I care deeply about, how would I want me to respond? So there's this idea. Jesus is like, all right, it all comes back to this, the one command, love one another. But he's not done. Okay? In fact, he says something new. He says this is a new command. Now, if you're there and you're listening, you'd be like, wait a minute, Jesus, we talked about love before. At this point, he had told them the Good Samaritan, if you ever heard that story. You know, the guy who loves his neighbor. He's like, we've covered this. You've said love earlier, but like, what's the new part about this? And here he says, a new command I give to you, love one another. This is the new part. He says, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. Now, this took 3 years to illustrate, and he actually wasn't done illustrating what his love looked like because he was about to go give his life for these people. But he's talking to people that had been pushed out of society, that had been rejected, that had issues. He's talking to people who had and would reject him and betray him. He's talking to people who had all these problems, never seem to get it. And the whole time he's concerned for their good, non-stop. And he's like, you've been living on the receiving end of that for years. You know what that's like. Now go live like this for other people, toward other people. And so it's a pretty high standard. Now, if you're taking that seriously, like you're like, all right, I'm gonna do that. It should feel somewhat unrealistic. Like, I'm gonna love like Jesus. Jesus loves, he's like, as I have loved, so you love. You know what that should feel like? That should feel like you watching Michael Jordan play basketball and him being like, as I have played, so you play. Or someone else who's really good at what they do and be like, go do what, he's pretty much the best at it. And he's like, do it like I have. And so that should be pretty like, whoa, I don't know if I can do that. Maybe you could give it a try. Maybe you've never heard that before. And you go out, and if you're like me, like sometimes I'd leave church services like this and be like, all right, here we go, you know, and like go out there. And it takes me to the parking lot, you know, where someone parked too close to my car. And I'm like, look at this guy. You know, like it's when the other side is not worthy of love, it just goes right out the window. But the amazing thing about this is that Jesus is not just, when he says, as I have loved you, he's not just talking about a standard. He's also talking about the source of the love that we show. And what I find so interesting about this is that this is where Jesus is totally lined up with what we know in popular psychology right now. Like a general rule of thumb in the world of psychology, and you know this if you're into this, is that we tend to show the love that we feel. Right? When we feel loved, we pretty naturally show love to people who don't deserve it. When we don't feel loved or worthy of love, it is very hard to show love to people. It's why if you have a really bad day at work, like let's say you just totally blow it and you feel like you let everyone down, you're disappointed and you got yelled at and you're mad and you're feeling shame and all this stuff and you feel unworthy, right? Or you just played a sport and you missed the game-winning shot, or you just failed a big test, or whatever. You feel that shame, like that feeling of being unworthy of love. You come home and whoever's there waiting for you, I'm willing to bet you've got less patience than on most days. Because when we feel unworthy of love, it is harder to express it. But if you just killed it, like if you've got amazing news, you just got some huge promotion, you just passed the test, you just got into the school of your dreams, you just hit it out of the park, you come home and those little annoyances all of a sudden aren't nearly as annoying as they were before. It's easier to show love, to seek the good of people who don't deserve it when we are feeling valued and loved. And so Jesus is hitting this nail right on the head. And he's like, I'm asking you to show love to people who do not deserve it. And so what you need to do is constantly bring yourself back to the place of knowing how much I love you when you don't deserve it. And this is why we talk so much about God's love, not just because it makes us feel good, not just because it's a nice thing, but it's because it's supposed to be the source from which we love other people. What's amazing is that Jesus went on after this to explain exactly what it looks like. He explained a vine and branches. And he's like, if you're gonna do this, you need to, he used the word abide. He's like, you need to abide in me. Or you can translate that word remain. You need to remain in me. And he literally says, remain in my love. I read that, I'm like, well, what does that mean? Like, where is it? Is it here? Is it there? Like, how exactly do I do that? But what he's saying is keep your mind there. And this is a discipline. It needs to become a habit. We need to constantly bring ourselves back and continue to feed the belief that we are loved at our absolute worst, at rock bottom, when we doubt, when we struggle to believe, when you've just failed everything and your whole life's falling apart. To know that you are loved at the bottom of your very bottom is so important to you being able to actually love other people. But we've got to bring ourselves there. Like, we've got to put our minds on that reality. Just recently, I read a book, and I feel like it explained this idea so clearly. Probably the best way that I feel like I've heard it is a book. It's called Practicing the Way by John Mark Comer. And he explains this idea, right? So Jesus says, abide in me, and you will bear much fruit. That means like remain in me and you'll see results, okay? And so here's how he explains that. He says, the question isn't, this is the author, he says the question isn't, are you abiding? You are. He says, it's what are you abiding in? All of us have a source we're rooted in, a kind of default setting we return to. He uses the phrase, an emotional home. It's where our minds go when they're not busy with tasks, where our feelings go when we need solace, where our bodies go when we have free times. We will make our home somewhere. The question is where? He says, and this matters because whatever we abide in will determine the fruit of our lives, for good or for ill. He says, if we are rooted in the infinite scroll of social media, it will form us, likely into people who are angry, anxious, arrogant, simplistic, and distracted. He says if we're rooted in the endless queues of our streaming platforms of choice, they too will form us. Not that these things are bad, but if that's your emotional home, he says it will bear fruit. Likely will turn into people who are restless, bored, and never present to what is. If we're rooted in the pursuit of hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure, Another drink, another toke, or another hookup to take the edge off the pain and let us find a moment's peace, that will form us as well, likely into people who are compulsive, addictive, and running from our pain and simultaneously our healing. The idea is, like, where do your thoughts go when you're not giving them a place to go? Where is your place of rest? This is why it's so important what comes to your mind when you think about God. When you think about God, you feel like inadequacy and shame, and I didn't do all the right things. God must be so upset. That's not going to be a place of rest, so you're going to go somewhere else. But if you know you are like cared for, treasured, put it in whatever words you need to. That God loves you more than your parents, more than your grandmother, more than the girl that had a crush on you in high school. Like, you are loved so much more than that, unconditionally, with a gift type of love, and that's where you return. It will turn you into someone who leaks that onto other people. A psychologist and spiritual director, a guy named David Benner, he says this. He says, meditating, thinking about God's love, he says, has done more to increase my love than decades of effort to try to be more loving. Allowing myself to deeply experience his love, taking time to soak it in and allow it to infuse me has begun to affect changes that I'd given up hope of ever experiencing. Coming back to God and my failures at love, throwing myself into his arms and asking him to remind me of how much he loves me as I am, here I begin to experience new levels of love to give to others. The idea here is if you want to love like Jesus, the idea is to remind yourself, to bring yourself back, and whatever it takes, to his unrelenting love for you. Not to just try harder. That will exhaust you, and you'll feel empty and dry very quickly. Very quickly. We can't show love that we haven't felt. We're incapable of doing it. And so the challenge is to constantly bring your mind back there. Now, okay, so if we just like kind of collect ourselves, sum things up real quick, right? We said like all the things, they're motivated like by God's concern for you. He wants good for you. He loves you, right? If you want a picture of what it looks like, all these things, you want a picture of what it looks like, it's love. And then Jesus says one more thing in this verse. Says, I have loved you, so you love one another. And then he gives them like a little test that's baked into it, right? In case you're wondering if you're getting this right. He says, so by this, everyone will know that you're my disciples, that you're my followers, that you're trying to follow the way that I'm teaching. This is the way. Are you ready? This is the way. Like, this is how people will know that today, if you want to translate to today's terms, like, this is how people will know today that you believe. This is how people will know that you're a Christian. This is how people know you follow Jesus. This is supposed to be, like, this is the test to know if you're getting it right. They will know you, ready? If you love one another. We just said that. But he, like, brings it back. Now, this is, like, the problem with this for so many of us, the reason this doesn't hit home is because we've heard it before. If you've heard this before. But maybe you haven't. And maybe you're here today like, whoa, really? The church is, Jesus said the church was supposed to be known for the way they seek the good of other people and the communities that they live in. I don't know about you, but that's not the reputation of the church that I grew up around. I told you, if you were here a few weeks ago, I told you when I got here with a friend of mine, we went around, we asked people, like, hey, if you were to describe the church, like, just give us one word, your impression, your experience with church. What was it? Hypocritical, judgmental, money hungry, fake, exclusive, impractical, unhelpful. Like, love, promise, didn't come up. And Jesus is like, this is the thing that you should be known for. I think like this, if you're a follower of Jesus, if you're not, I hope that this is like enlightening to you and helps you realize if you've been pushed away from church, maybe it's because the church has got something terribly wrong. But this should like wake us up if you're a follower of Jesus. Sometimes when we picture what it looks like to follow Jesus, we have this picture of like a religious person You know, when I started to believe this myself, I was away at school and I was like, all right, this makes sense to me. Like, I believe Jesus is who he said he is. So show me what it looks like. And I just looked for people that I thought were doing the Christian thing. And you know what I became? I believed I needed to talk about God all the time. Every conversation needed to talk about God. Everyone. I needed to be like very outspoken with things I was against. I needed to learn all the terms and all the lingo and start using it. I needed to play a part. If you talk to my brother will tell you, he's like, you went away to school, you came back, and you were so awkward. And it's because my picture was like this, really like not a Jesus follower, but like a Jesus fan. You know, like I'll just be like super into it, talking about it all the time. That's not, in my mind, that was the picture of maturity and spiritual growth. What Jesus is saying here is that spiritual growth should not be measured in how outwardly religious you look, but in how deeply concerned for the good of others you are. And so if you're someone, and I know I've spoken to some of you who are like, I believe this, I'm on board with it, but I don't want to be one of those religious people. Don't. The idea is to be deeply concerned about other people. Jesus said we should be known for our love, not even known for what we believe. But you might be surprised. If people start to know you for the way that you treat other people, the way that you love, they might begin to be curious about what you believe. And so what if this was the thing that we were known for? What if this was the picture that came to mind when someone thought of a follower of Jesus? Okay, I don't believe the things that they believe, but I sure would love my daughter to marry one of them. I'd love to work for one of them. What if we were known for the way we cared about other people? This was Jesus' vision for the church, and this is the kind of community we want to be. People who are deeply concerned about others. This is the picture that should come to mind when we talk about being a follower of Jesus.